They expected death. Instead, they were offered water. In the closing months of 1943, across the scattered islands of the Pacific, Japanese soldiers began to surrender, not in great numbers, but enough to raise questions within both armies. For years, imperial propaganda had declared that capture meant dishonor worse than death. American leaflets urging surrender were dismissed as deceit. The Japanese soldier was taught that mercy did not exist among enemies, and that to fall alive into American hands was to invite torture or humiliation. Yet when it happened, in a quiet stretch of sand in the Solomon Islands, or in the shattered remains of a jungle bunker on Saipantha, reality defied everything they had believed. An American corporal, sunburned and sweating, approached a group of wounded prisoners. Their hands trembled. One clutched a grenade without a pin. The guard stopped several paces away, raised his hands to show they were empty, and placed a dented canteen on the ground. He took 2 steps back. No one moved. The sea hissed in the distance. Flies circled. Finally, a prisoner limped forward. He looked at the canteen as if it were a trap. His lips cracked open. The water inside smelled of metal and salt, but it was clean. He drank cautiously at first, then with desperate gulps. The guard did not speak. He simply waited, nodding once before turning away. In that moment, the world shifted. For the first time, these men raised to believe that Americans were beasts saw something else. Not kindness. Not yet. But restraint. In the reports written later by U.S. officers, this scene appeared again and again. Prisoners astonished not by their capture, but by their survival. They looked for cruelty and found confusion. They expected execution and met procedure. The paradox of mercy had entered the Pacific War. They arrived at dusk. The trucks rattled down a gravel road bordered by pine trees, their engines echoing through the humid air of Oahu. Each prisoner sat stiffly, hands tied loosely in front of him, eyes fixed on the horizon. The camp appeared like a mirage rose of wooden barracks, a watchtower, and the faint smell of cooked beans drifting through the wind. For the Japanese soldiers, the sight was disorienting. The camp did not resemble the cages they had imagined. It looked instead like a small town, orderly, almost peaceful. An American sergeant called out numbers, not names. The prisoners stepped down one by one, their bare feet brushing the dust. A medic checked each man briefly. Pulse, temperature, a glance at their wounds. One prisoner flinched when the medic reached for his arm. "Easy," the American said quietly. "No pain." The prisoner didn't understand the words, but the tone firm, unthreatening made him pause. Inside the gate, guards gave them metal trays and pointed toward a mess tent. The prisoners hesitated, whispering among themselves. They had been told that American food was unclean, laced with forbidden ingredients. Yet the smell of bread and coffee broke through their fear. They ate slowly. The first bite of white bread soft, foreign stuck to the roof of the mouth. One man gagged, another wept. They were ashamed of their hunger. That night, lying on canvas bunks under a ceiling fan, they heard music from the guardhouse, a radio playing swing. The rhythm was alien but oddly soothing. Outside, someone laughed a sound too casual for a battlefield, in the darkness. Private Ito whispered to the man beside him, "Are we ghosts?" The other replied after a long silence, "If we were, they would not feed us." For the first time in months, the prisoners slept without the sound of gunfire. They did not yet understand the rules of this new world. But they sensed one thing clearly. Here, survival itself was an act of disbelief. The next morning began with a whistle. Not a shout, not the bark of a command, just a single, shrill note slicing through the early light. The prisoners rose instantly, out of habit rather than comprehension. They lined up outside the barracks, heads bowed, unsure what to expect. A guard moved down the line, counting quietly, tapping a clipboard. There were no blows, no rifles pointed at faces. The rules, translated later by an interpreter, were simple. Wake at 6, meals at 7 and 12. Roll call twice a day, lights out at 9. No fighting, no escape attempts, no damage to property. Within those boundaries, life would proceed with surprising normalcy. Each man received 2 uniform stiff khaki-marked PWA towel, a bar of soap, and a toothbrush. Their heads were not shaved, their names not replaced by numbers. The Americans even allowed them to keep their rank insignia. It's a gesture that puzzled many. Every few days, a truck arrived with supplies. The guards unloaded sacks of flour, tins of meat, vegetables, and coffee. Sometimes the prisoners helped, eager to prove their usefulness. In return, they were paid in camp coupons exchangeable at the small canteen for cigarettes, stationery, or canned fruit. The canteen became a quiet center of curiosity. On its shelves stood items they had never seen before: peanut butter, bubble gum, chocolate bars wrapped in silver foil. Most stared, hesitant to touch them. These were objects from another planet, a world of abundance. Existing in the midst of war, discipline remained firm but measured. Minor infractions, talking during roll call, hoarding food, were punished by extra duties, not beatings. The American guards were young, often only a few years older than the prisoners. Some had fought on the same islands where these men had been captured. They did not speak much, but their restraint carried a message more powerful than words. The prisoners began to sense that their captors followed rules, not out of weakness, but conviction. It was a system structured, impersonal, almost bureaucratic, that left no room for vengeance. From a distance, the camp looked calm, laundry lines fluttering in the sun, men tending small gardens near the fence. But inside each prisoner, confusion grew. This was not the America they had been warned about. It was something harder to hate. The heat that summer was relentless. Dust hung in the air like ash, settling into clothes, hair, and lungs. Showers were rare, brief sprays of lukewarm water that left the men only half clean. For soldiers who had lived for months in trenches and caves, the grime felt permanent, a second skin. One afternoon, as the prisoners returned from unloading a supply truck, a guard named Miller noticed a man lagging behind. His uniform was stiff with sweat and dirt. The guard stopped him gently and pointed toward a water pump behind the barracks. "Go on," Miller said, gesturing. "Wash." The prisoner froze, didn't understand the words, but he saw the motion of the hand, the open stance, no weapon drawn. Miller reached into his pocket, pulled out a small bar of soap, and placed it on the edge of the pump. It was pale yellow, with the faint scent of lemon. The man hesitated, then turned the handle. Water splashed over his hands, cool and startling. He rubbed the soap between his palms, and a thin foam appeared. As for a moment the scene could have been mistaken for any ordinary afternoon anywhere in the world, a man washing his hands after work. When he was done, the prisoner bowed slightly. Miller nodded once, expression unreadable, then walked away. Later that night, the man Corporal Tanakito'd others in whispers what had happened. He described the soap's smell, the guard's calm, the water that ran clear. The others listened in silence. Some frowned, others looked down, uncertain how to react to them. Cleanliness had always been a form of discipline, not mercy. Yet here, the enemy had offered it freely. The next morning, 2 more men went to the pump. By the end of the week, the soap had worn down to a thin sliver, passed quietly from hand to hand. It became, without intention, a small symbol of something none of them could yet define respect. Perhaps, or the fragile beginning of trust. For the guards, it was nothing. For the prisoners, it was the first kindness they could not explain. Weeks became months. The routine settled into something resembling rhythm, roll. Call, meals, work, rest. The sound of boots on gravel marked the passing of time more than the calendar did. Every morning, small work details left the gate under light supervision. Some went to nearby farms, others repaired fences or cleared debris from storm damage. The guards rarely carried loaded rifles. Escape attempts were rare, not because of fear, but because there was nowhere to go. In the fields, prisoners learned fragments of English. Water, shovel, lunch. The Americans laughed gently at the attempts, sometimes teaching new words in exchange for Japanese ones. The communication was clumsy but human. Back in the camp, they began to adapt. A group of prisoners built a small garden behind one of the barracks, using seeds found in kitchen waste. They grew radishes, onions, and a few struggling tomatoes. It reminded them of home. Others began to write. Using paper from the canteen, they recorded daily thoughts, sketches, and memories. One entry read, "The guards smile. It is strange. I cannot decide whether to trust them or to pity them." On Sundays, some guards played baseball on a dusty field near the fence. The prisoners watched, puzzled by the shouting and laughter. Eventually, one guard tossed a ball through the wire. It rolled to a stop at the feet of Private Ito. He picked it up slowly, tested its weight, and threw it back. The guard caught it and grinned. No words were exchanged, but the gesture was repeated the next week, and the one after that. Evenings were quiet. The air smelled of pine and smoke from the kitchen fires. Some prisoners folded origami from scrap paper. Others hummed old army songs under their breath. The tension of the early days faded into something more complex, a dull ache of waiting. Mixed with reluctant comfort, the American guards rotated shifts, but a few faces became familiar. They were young, often just boys. Their lives suspended like those of the men they watched. The prisoners began to notice details. One guard always chewed gum, another carried a small Bible in his pocket. These tiny observations filled the silence, reminding them that their captors were individuals, not symbols. By late autumn, the camp had changed tone. The fences still stood, the rules still held, but the fear had thinned. The prisoners were still soldiers of a defeated empire, yet they woke each day to the sound of birds, not bombs, and that in itself felt like a quiet miracle. Sergeant Nakamura had once been the perfect soldier. Before his capture on Saipan, he had written in his diary that surrender was worse than death. In the camp, he spoke little and ate less. When guards passed food, he turned away, muttering prayers under his breath. Weeks later, when his health began to fail, the camp doctor insisted on treatment. Nakamura resisted, convinced the Americans were humiliating him by keeping him alive. But one morning, he accepted a small cup of broth from the doctor's hands. The warmth surprised him. That same evening, he whispered to a fellow prisoner, "They want us to live. I don't understand why." Private Ito was younger, barely 20. He was fascinated by every news site, the trucks, the canned fruit, even the loudspeakers playing American jazz. He traded cigarettes for small pieces of gum and learned to say thank you with a shy grin. The guards called him Shorty. He never understood the nickname but laughed anyway. For Ito, captivity was not freedom, but it was life in color again. In a letter never sent, he wrote, "I thought I would die in the jungle. Instead, I am learning the language of my enemy." Corporal Tanaka, the former school teacher, watched everything with quiet detachment. He kept a notebook hidden under his mattress, filled with neat handwriting and observations about American behavior. "They do not seem to hate us," he wrote. "They are efficient, but not cruel. They follow laws even when no one sees." Oh. Tanaka had once lectured his students about Western decadence. Now, he found himself reconsidering what that word meant. The three men often sat together in the evenings, saying little. Nakamura stared at the ground, Ito played with a stone, and Tanaka watched the sunset through the fence. The light turned the barbed wire gold. "When this ends," Ito murmured one night, "what will we tell them back home?" Tanaka closed his notebook. The truth, perhaps. But who would believe it? Their differences captured the unspoken spectrum of captivity, shame, curiosity, reflection. Each man carried a different war inside him, shaped less by battle than by the quiet contradictions of mercy. For the guards, they were numbers on a list. For history, they would remain anonymous. But within the camp, they became something more. Witnesses to a strange and disarming truth that humanity, once shown, could not be unseen. By winter, the camp had settled into a quiet pattern, but beneath its surface, unease grew. For many of the Japanese prisoners, kindness was harder to endure than cruelty. Violence they could explain. Compassion they could not. Sergeant Nakamura, still weak but recovering, sat by the fence each evening. Across the yard he could see the guards sharing cigarettes, laughing together. He felt something close to envy and shame for feeling it. If they are monsters, he thought, why do they laugh like men? The imperial code had taught that a captured soldier ceased to exist. To accept food, warmth, or mercy from the enemy was to dishonor one's ancestors. But inside the camp, that code began to crumble. Each act of decency, each blanket folded neatly, each gesture of respect struck at the foundation of what they had believed. Corporal Tanaka recorded the tension in his notes. The young ones adapt easily. They learn words, even jokes. The older ones resist. They prefer anger, it feels like home. Private Ito, the most open among them, had begun to help in the camp kitchen. He learned to stir beans over a wide steel pot, and sometimes whistled along with the American cook's radio. When Nakamura saw him smile, he turned away in disgust. That night, he confronted him. "You forget who you are." "I remember," Ito replied quietly, "but I am still alive." The conversation ended there, neither man convinced. As the months passed, prisoners were offered opportunities to work outside the wire. Many volunteered not for freedom but for a sense of purpose. They repaired roads, harvested crops, and built fences on American soil. The guards called them the polite workers. The irony was not lost on them, but at night the conflict returned. Some dreamed of home and woke in tears. Others prayed softly, asking forgiveness for surviving. In the dark barracks, the silence felt heavier than the fences themselves. Tanaka's journal summed it simply: "It is not the war that breaks men. It is mercy." The guards never knew how deep the struggle ran. To them, the prisoners seemed calm, cooperative, grateful even. But inside each man was a quiet storm, the slow collision of loyalty and humanity. Honor and hunger, ideology, and the simple, unbearable kindness of the enemy. The first rumor came with a mail truck. One of the guards mentioned that Germany had surrendered. Another said the Americans were preparing to invade Japan. The prisoners listened in silence, unsure what to believe. Information arrived piecemeal, whispers. Headlines glimpsed through the canteen window. A radio broadcast half heard from the Gorth Os. Then, in early August 1945, everything changed. A translator, a Nisei soldier of Japanese descent, gathered the prisoners in the yard. His face was grave as he read the news aloud in careful, formal Japanese. Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb. Tens of thousands were dead. No one moved. Some blinked as if the words themselves could not be real. Others stared at the ground, unable to process the scale. Tanaka wrote later that the silence lasted nearly 10 minutes. No one spoke. We did not weep. We did not breathe. We had no language for what we had just heard. 3 days later came Nagasaki. Then the emperor's voice broadcast to the nation and through translators to the camp. For most of the prisoners, it was the first time they had ever heard him speak. His tone was calm, distant, almost sorrowful. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. The war, he said, was over. Some fell to their knees. Others stood frozen, unable to accept that the divine had surrendered. Nakamura pressed his forehead against the dirt. Ito cried openly. Tanaka sat motionless, his notebook open but blank. The guards did not cheer. They simply watched, understanding that something immense had ended inside those men. That evening, the American captain ordered an extra meal, served rice, pork, and small portions of canned peaches. He said it was in respect for the dead. No speeches were made. The prisoners ate in silence, each bite tasting both like relief and loss. For months they had survived on disbelief, able to accept kindness, yet unable to refuse it. Now the disbelief shifted. Their country was gone, their emperor human, their enemies merciful. That night, rain began to fall slow, steady, cleansing. The men stepped outside the barracks and stood under it, letting it wash the dust from their faces. Some whispered prayers. Others simply lifted their heads and closed their eyes. The barbed wire glistened under the storm. And for the first time since their capture, the sound of rain did not feel like punishment. It sounded, strangely, like home. By the winter of 1945, preparations began to send the prisoners home. The camp's routines grew quieter. The guards packed supplies, Medical officers signed papers, and translators moved from barrack to barrack explaining the process. Each man would receive clean clothes, a small food ration, and a certificate of release. Some greeted the news with relief, others, unexpectedly, with dread. Private Ito spent his last days helping in the kitchen, polishing pots until they shone. He laughed easily now, his English fluent enough for small jokes. When he learned that his transport ship would leave in 2 days, he asked to work one final shift. The cook let him. Before leaving, Ito folded a small note under a tin of coffee. "Thank you for teaching me how to live again." Sergeant Nakamura was thinner, his posture straighter. He had stopped resisting food, but the shame of survival still clung to him. On the morning of departure, he stood near the gate staring at the flagpole. The stars and stripes flapped in the cold wind. A guard noticed him and asked softly, "You ready?" Nakamura nodded. He did not answer, but his eyes lingered on the flag, as if memorizing it. Corporal Tanaka filled the final pages of his notebook on the ship. Back to Japan. The journey was quiet. The sea stretched endlessly, gray and calm. When they reached Yokohama, the city lay in ruins, buildings scorched, streets empty, air thick with the smell of ash. Families waited on the docks, searching for familiar faces. Many prisoners returned to no one. Home was not home anymore. Some villagers looked away from the repatriated soldiers, whispering that captivity had corrupted them. The imperial code had left deep scars. Tanaka wrote. They ask what the Americans were like. I tell them they followed rules even when they could have broken them. They treated us as men. They washed us, fed us, and called us by name. No one believes me. A few of the former prisoners later joined cultural exchange programs, translating books or teaching English in schools rebuilt with American aid. Others never spoke of their captivity again. For those who lived it, the memory of the camp did not fade. It stayed in small details: the scent of soap, the sound of jazz, the feel of rain on clean skin. Mercy had changed them in ways they could not explain quietly, permanently, like water shaping stone. Years later, when the war had receded into memory and the camps had vanished under fields and highways, a few former prisoners and guards met again. Not in ceremony, but by chance, through letters, academic conferences, or the slow drift of time that sometimes brings enemies into quiet conversation. They spoke without bitterness. The guards, now gray-haired, said they had only followed orders to treat prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. The former POWs nodded, understanding that what had once felt like compassion had, to the other side, been nothing more than procedure. Yet between them lay the memory of something that had gone beyond rules. For the Japanese soldiers, kindness of their captors had carried a strange weight. It had stripped them of excuses, forced them to see the enemy as human and themselves as vulnerable. For many, that realization was harder than captivity itself. Corporal Tanaka's final note, found decades later. Among his papers, summed it in one line: they won the war not only with fire, but with mercy. He did not mean victory in battle, but in conscience. History records wars through numbers: the dead, the wounded, the cities erased. What it rarely counts are the small mercies that challenge hatred in silence: the cup of water placed on the ground, the bar of soap shared, the meals served without a word. These gestures did not end the war, but they changed its meaning. They revealed that even amid destruction, humanity could persist, not as triumph, but as quiet defiance. When the last camp closed and the fences came down, nothing grand was said. The men walked out carrying their belongings in silence. Some looked back once at the towers, the barracks, the flag. Others did not. But all of them, in some unspoken way, carried the same invisible burden: the realization that mercy, once given, can never be forgotten. In the history of war, kindness rarely leaves a monument, yet its trace remains in the memories of those who received it and in the conscience of those who offered it. It is the weight of mercy, unseen, unrecorded, but impossible to erase.